Well, good evening. First, we want to thank our phenomenal preachers for such a dynamic word. We thank you both. And to you all, our audience, thank you for joining us once again, first for service and now for the talkback. We don't want to belabor the time, so we'll get right into it. Dr. Bryant, you preached from the title, I Could, But I Won't. And I will start with my question for you. And that question would be, what does I could, but I won't look like for you?
It is restrained will. The call of pastoring black people is a presumed humility of suffering. That you are supposed to allow people to disrespect your family. That people should have the right to question your personal finances. For people to call into question your credentials in the face of people who have none. And so the humility that we are called to walk in is a phrase that we don't use till Lent, is self-denial. Pastor Smith and I have earned doctorates in a field of people with GEDs who call themselves doctor. And so we have to have the restraint not to correct you. So it is that level of humility of our fathers, both in ministry, had to live in an era where you had to hide the new car. If you drive a certain car, that's going to impact tithes and offerings. Or we would have to live through hearing members say, we bought that. And question how it is that the first family sacrifices all for many. But when it is that you find yourself having to give with no reprieve, we are the only profession in the world that has to not announce you going on vacation. We're the only profession in the world that are guilted for a day off. Is that if you didn't preach Sunday, people think you didn't work that week. Not knowing that preaching is just 10% of what you do. But the full mass of it, the call for emotional wholeness of humility that both of us, and this is with no conversation with Pastor Smith leading up to it, would have to have known moments of our fathers having to elect sacrifice they didn't vote on. So my father had the largest AME church. Well, he pastored the largest church in Baltimore. And I grew up in a house with no air conditioning. So it is that level of humility that you have to fight through. And so the restraint is what I was really underscoring about the meekness of what Jesus had to master, to not answer people who didn't have the right to question them, is humility.
Thank you.
Dr. Smith, your sermon title is Greater is Calling. And I want to ask, on your perspective from the church, what is hindering us to being greater, and define your meaning of greater also?
That's a great question. I think the challenge with the African American church, but the church at large, and it's been even more evident since Trumpism, is there has been this affinity for us to communicate
the name Jesus without demonstrating the nature of Jesus. And hence Christianity as a whole is in trouble. When you think about what has happened from an evangelical lens, and even in terms of the rise of the health and wealth and prosperity gospel, it has made us more myopic and more individualistic and less communal. I think we've become at ease in Zion. And a lot of the strides that the African American church and community has made, particularly since the rise of the civil rights movement, we're on the verge of losing. When you think about Morehouse and HBCUs and other institutions, whether it be the businesses on Auburn Avenue, and that's why I appreciate so much what Dr. Bryant is doing in terms of the new Wall Street and other entrepreneurial endeavors, because I think we are being forced now as a body to take ownership of our own communities. And I think it has to come from an educational, from a financial, just a social and a civic perspective. And so for me, that greater call, the greatest calling, is to be the body of Christ, and to be the salt of the earth, and to bring about more of the I am because we are. And so I'm just very fearful that if we don't get a grasp, I think greater. Unfortunately, a lot of our clergy and a lot of even African Americans now, even in terms from a political perspective, we are so jaded by one or two issues that have been used and theology has been weaponized, where we will look at things like same-sex marriage and abortion and cast our votes for parties that don't even represent the interest of all of humanity, because of a lower perspective in terms of theological reflection. So I think we just have to look at the call of God in terms of how do we become constituencies and of the kingdom of God. And so the greater call to entrepreneurship, a greater call to service, a greater call to educate and empower our communities, and a less dependence on the powers that be to do that. The master is not coming to save us. Wow. And until we realize that, and I think a greater call to reduce some of the theological violence that we commit amongst ourselves, a greater call that it's going to take the entire village, and Bell Hooks once talked about, that love ethic, and I think that call so we can come together for the betterment of our communities. Joe Gregory says that he believes that the hope of the world is in the black preacher and the black church. And I believe that heeding that call of greater can help us to transform things if we don't continue to take the perspectives of our slave masters.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
My next question, well, I attempted to write questions, but I stood up too many times to really get any down. But I have a lot of thoughts that I want to direct towards both of you to touch on some parts that both of you have both mentioned now and in your sermons. I want to explore this idea of humility that we have crafted and shaped that may not be the true meaning of humility. Both of you have shared about your lives growing up and what humility caused your families to do. And it seems as though we explore a lot into different religions and different practices. And I was immediately reminded of Buddhism, where they practice heavily self-denial. And when we live in an age of mental health awareness, I came to the conclusion and became aware that self-denial can often be very damaging. Not giving yourself the proper credits and credentials, having to play small to make others feel comfortable. And this calling for greater not only goes for us but for our community. And I'm happy that you were able to tie in how important it is to cast our vote, because that is our future. We have to care enough about ourselves and our future in order to cast our votes, just to make sure that life is better onward. But I want to ask you, you both, how damaging and how dangerous can humility be when you use it as almost as a self-inflicting weapon to yourself, to where you no longer regard yourself as high as you should? We play this game of imposter syndrome and comparing ourselves to other, and we take credit from ourselves and we damage ourselves as in return. So I want to, if you would both speak onto that.
Humility is the bastardized birthright of black men. Is that the culture had us not look people in the eye. To keep your head down low.
Wow.
To not question those who are in authority. To not be humble is to get castrated. Is to get hung. There's a poem by Langston Hughes, the black child, meek and mild. God forbid the day that they change their minds. And so it is what George Jury talks about in post-traumatic slave syndrome, is that we presume a posture of humility that we inherited, but were never taught. And so the process of becoming a Morehouse man is a revolutionary act of having the nerve to institutionalize self-esteem. Is that this is the only place where you find the pride of being a black man without apology. And so go through wherever it is that you're from, whoever it is. I'm talking to the black males who are here. It is only black men who have to deflect affirmation. Oh, you great. I ain't that good. Man, that was amazing what you did. It wasn't all of that. Man, look at what you got on. Oh, this old thing. Because we have been acculturated to assume a place of humility, and there is no middle ground. So people who don't understand you presume arrogance. Oh, they didn't spank. They must think they all of that. You go into a position, we got to go through the crab barrel process because it is only being a black man in America that you have to apologize for ambition. That nothing in us gives us the license to say, I want a mega church. Nothing in your call gives you permission to say, I want to have a global ministry. We have been neutered to believe the neighborhood. That is the depth of our calling and our assignment, and to even aspire to more than that is a insult to people who have embraced being runaway slaves. Yeah, how dare you think that you're going to be known? What makes you think you'll be wealthy without entertaining? There is no other culture in the world that would not have stood up and shut Herschel Walker down. We gave him a pass because he's lived up to the tropes of white people's success. Because he can run gives him legitimacy against a black man that can think. And so you have to think in no other area could you ever find that in any other field than for black people.
Yeah, that's powerful. You know, I think we have to be clear that there's a difference between humility and feelings of inferiority. Wow. Walking in humility does not mean a lack of awareness of who you are. That's right. When I think about Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, that who thought it not robbery, that though he was equal with God. So humility Humility does not mean that we have to lower oneself and lower one's value and reduce the understanding of who we are. Jesus walked with humility, but he emptied himself. That was an emptying of his divine attributes, but not a lack of acknowledgement for who he was. He humbled himself and he became obedient. I think what happens to us, as Dr. Bryant was talking about earlier, we tend to have this perspective as if knowing who I am and being confident about what God has called me to be is the prevalence and the availability of arrogance and conceit. Knowing who you are, knowing what you've been called to do, knowing that you've been equipped does not mean that you're not humble. I think the lack of humility comes in when we begin to elevate ourselves above others and think it's about us and not about the community or the people that we serve. And I think in terms of a clergy perspective, there's been such a challenge amongst clergy, and I want to just say this to the preachers who are here, that the lack of humility amongst us has caused us to now compete with each other. And so now there's not a difference really between the Crips and the Bloods and the Methodists and the Apostles, because we all have our own blocks. Wow. And we're slinging our own dope on our corners to see who can get the most customers. And so now we can't even trust each other because we want to outdo each other, which I believe is one of the blessings of the pandemic, because God shut it all down and now we all became televangelists. And now nobody's got nobody in the choir. I was just talking to Dr. Brown earlier. Today was the first day having the choir back. We're talking more now than we ever have because it stripped us of some of the attributes. And now instead of us now we're doing more to communicate and to compliment each other versus cremating each other. So I believe knowing who we are should make us more communicative to work with each other to lift up the community. But when it's all about me and my ego and my own narcissism and my own elitism and my own insecurities, that now has made so many of us, get 50 members and make 48 of them armor bearers, because we need them to satiate our own ego and a sense of self-worth. And so I think humility is the understanding of who you are, the confidence in who you are, and knowing that we all have different paths and different walks. I can celebrate what Dr. Bryant is doing. I can celebrate what Bishop Jakes is doing, because I know that I have my own walk and my own path. And so whatever I can do to support them in their efforts, God has called them to touch a people that I may never be able to reach. But I know what God has called me to do. And so I realize now that I have an oil that's on my life. I operate in my oil because my oil knows my name. And at the end of the day, if God only gives me 100 members to preach to on Sunday, that's 100 more than I deserve to. So humility is the awareness that I stand at the feet of Jesus and that everything I have, it belongs to him, and I have been chosen and called to assist the community, to help others to find God. It's not about my own church, it's about the kingdom of God. And humility is the understanding that if I stay small enough long enough, God will make me big enough soon enough, and he determines what's big enough.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
All right, I have one more question for you, Dr. Smith, and then we'll open the floor for questions. You mentioned in your sermon, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Jesus emptied himself to be like us, and even maybe some of his omnipotence. And I like that because you brought me back to history of Christian thought and also intro to philosophy, how we talk about that. Some people may think that there may not be a 3-0 God, called narrow atheism. So with that point, that Jesus emptied himself to be like us, even some of his omnipotence, can you expound a little bit more in this setting what you meant by saying that?
Today was really tough because everything I was going to preach, Dr. Bryant preached it, so I knew I was in trouble. Seriously, from the very subject. So I had to write the sermon on the stage because everything I was going to say, he said that, and he got that. So I'm having to think, and so that's not what I was going to preach because he preached the whole sermon. And so thank you, Dean Carter. Thank you, Quincy, for anyway. So for me, I decided okay, well, let me take, since he's dealing with the pragmatic perspectives and his theology, let me just deal with more of a theological premise based upon what P.T. Forsyth said when he talks about the theory of kenosis, coming from that Philippians 2:7, that a voluntary emptying of what he may have enjoyed from a divine royal regalia perspective in heaven, that perhaps when Christ came to earth, he's of course an evangelical theologian, he was, when he came to earth, that in order to die, that he perhaps emptied himself of some of his divine attributes. This is P.T. Forsyth. And that for his estimation, that was the only way for Christ to die. You know, if you believe in the omnipotence of Jesus Christ. But then he says in Matthew 28:16, he got up on Sunday morning. And all the old preachers, he died on Friday. He buried him. And on Sunday morning, he got up with all power in his hands. We've heard that preached for years, those who've been in church. Well, if he got up with all power on his hands on Sunday morning, are you suggesting that he didn't have it before Sunday morning? So that's the epikenosis. That's the regaining, perhaps, in P.T. Forsyth's estimation, of what he left when he left his position in glory to come down to have a kenotic moment. So I was just trying to, piggyback on what Dr. Bryant says. I could. He could have called for 10,000 angels to execute vengeance on his behalf on Christ. He decided to die. He says, "No man take my life. I lay it down as a ransom for many." So it is that I could, but I won't. It is that restraining. It is that humility. But I just want to deal with it more from a theological perspective, and the best way I could do that was just kind of, what can I throw in right now? Well, it was P.T. Forsyth's theory of kenosis and then the epikenosis. So kenosis, he comes down, relinquishes omnipresence, that he could not have been omnipresent everywhere at the same time while on earth because he was limited by humanity. And perhaps he was not omnipotent while on earth, and that's why he has to regain power on Sunday morning. And that does not make him less Christ in P.T. Forsyth's estimation. So that was I was trying to throw in. I hope it made sense. This dude here made it just real hard. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. Yeah, you were dirty. You were low down. You were very dirty. You was not brotherly. That was not into ties, more brotherly. No, you knew I was coming. So that's what I was trying to say.
Yes, sir. We thank you. We'll open the floor now for a few questions.
Can you come up to the mic? Whoever's going to
ask a question. My question is directed towards Dr. Smith, and it is piggybacking off of the previous question that Damari has asked on Jesus emptying himself. And you used a biblical example of the blind man in Bethesda, which was quite interesting to me. And I want you to speak more to that because the scholar that I had done research on a long time ago, actually, in high school, suggested that it was not that Jesus had to touch the man twice because Jesus had emptied himself, but it was rather because Jesus had gave him divine vision. The man was seeing trees. We should be like trees planted by the rivers of water that beareth much fruit. And so I'm going to ask that you speak to both logics.
You sound one of them old preachers I just talked about. That's exactly how you sound. I get it. Great.
His research from high school.
It's interesting, that text is in the Markan account, which of course Mark is the first gospel. It is synoptic. And the goal of Mark is, of course, is not to present the deity of Jesus, but present the suffering servanthood of Jesus. And so the deity of Jesus is not the theme of Mark's gospel, only the theme in the Johannine account, number one. Number two, Jesus touches the man, and there are several, theological presuppositions as to why he touches him twice. One is for the first time, the man had sight previously. And so the first touch is why he asked, "What do you see?" He said, "I see men who walk as trees." That's the indication that the man could not have been born blind. Because if he had been born blind, he would not have had a knowledge of what trees look like. And so some have posited that that the two touches were to give us a lesson that Jesus still can come back and do it again. He's the God of renewal. I posited their P.T. Forsyth's estimation that the second touch could have been an indication of a lack of omnipotence. I'm not saying he was not. That's why I've always put Forsyth in the whole context, that the God of the universe who does something once, does he have to do it a second time if he's perfect in the first time? And so that is a passage that is used as an argument by some to question whether that kenotic moment happened and whether Jesus was showing us the ability even to do things again. Maybe he was saying to us, maybe the example was not for the blind man, but for us, that if you fail initially, that you can get up and keep pushing it. So there are plethora of hermeneutics and interpretations as to why that was need of a second touch. I just want to use that in context of Forsyth's theory of kenosis and the omnipotence, because the question is, does an omnipotent Christ have to do anything more than once if the first one is sufficient? Because if the first one is sufficient, is that necessity of the second one? You hear what I'm saying? So not to say that he was not omnipotent, but to use that as a passage that some have used to say that was a kenotic moment, that he could not have had all power at that moment if he has to touch him the second time. Some use that as an example. But we do know in Matthew 28:16 that he makes the indication that I have regained all power after the resurrection. That's P.T. Forsyth. So for me, even the omniscience of Jesus may be in question. On one occasion, if you look at it from a kenotic perspective, on one occasion, they asked Jesus about, eschatological references. And this is what Jesus says: no man knoweth the day, nor the hour, not even the Son of Man, only my Father. Does an omniscient Jesus make the indication that some things he doesn't know? If he's omniscient, how can he indicate that he does only the Father knows? Because omniscience would have given the ability to say, I know the day and the hour. Jesus never proclaimed to know that. Is that this voluntary emptying of himself? Is that the theory of kenosis? Is it because he lacked the epikenotic moments and nuances of his divinity that he only gets back at resurrection? So some suggest that we know omnipresence. He's not omnipresent while on earth, because he travels from here to there. He rests on the boat to have to get to the Sea of Gadara. You don't have to get on the boat and go to the Sea of Gadara if he's everywhere at the same time. Even he said, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, if he's omnipresent, does he have to leave? Because if he decided to go somewhere, when he got there, he'd bump into himself. So my whole premise there was just a scriptural reference that some use to suggest that maybe that's an indication that he was not omnipotent. Not my declarative statement of that reality. I just used that. Make sense, Doc?
Yes, sir.
I hope so. Go on with your bad self.
I have a general question, and that is, how do we learn to maximize our takeaway? As public speakers, it's often taught how to form a speech. But as listeners, we're not often taught how to digest the message. And I have personally learned a lot about listening through what I've suffered. I'm 46 years old. There's a lot of young people in this room. And I'm asking the question to be able to help them, more so than to help myself.
Well, my late mentor, Dr. Matt King Carter, I was very close to him from the time, I was 16 until he died. He he always impressed upon me and was always very, very, very tough on me. If he heard a message, he said, "Do it. It was a good sermon. It felt good, but you didn't leave the people with homework." That the sermon is not effective if people didn't leave with homework to give them something to reflect on, to make it. And that's the thing about preaching for us, because we're so emotional. As African American, idiomatic expressions were so rhythmic, the art of call and response. And James Cone says if we're not careful, the preaching moment is difficult in the African American church, because the African American church is the only place you can go and leave your brain at home. And so we have to balance between speaking to the soul and the emotions, but also leaving the people with some homework. And so the challenge there is to not become so dependent upon the response and to get caught up where we're so emotional in the preaching moment that we fail. What do I want people to take away from this? And then secondly, some lessons are best caught versus taught. And so some of my best lessons, I learned them in School of Hard Knocks. And so I just think if we can find something to take away, like how does this apply to me? What's my homework after hearing that message? And I think we also have to do a better job as preachers to leave people in a contemplative moment. Sometimes we feel like if we didn't shout, if they didn't holler, sometimes it's just best to have a moment of stillness. That's why I like to call it Christ consciousness, to make us think and reflect versus just feel. I think we need to feel, but what am I taking away? Is there a call to repentance? Is there a call to renewal? How can I recommit myself to the tenets? The message we heard today from Dr. Bryant, it'd be a crime and a shame for us to have enjoyed that and not have something that we take away. Our ministries, our lives would be better if we listen for the takeaway. While we enjoy the structure and the art, how beautifully crafted it was, but what is the homework? And I think that's something that I think we all have to ask ourselves. Did I lead the people with homework? Or did we just shout and have a good time? Especially with young people, because y'all will shout and tear the church up and shout right by the offering plate. So what's the homework?
Dean wanted to respond to that question.
Thank you so very much. Is this working for me? Yes. Okay. The young man, where is he, who asked that question? Maybe this will add just a little bit more to what has been said. In religion and in psychotherapy, reflection is necessary. So when you come to church to worship, you reflect, you think about what you're hearing. That's necessary as a beginning, but reflection can't be the whole thing. It won't take you where you'd like to go and where you're suggesting that you'd like to go in the question that you ask. Present, anticipated in reflection is change. It's possible from your reflection to actually make a decision to change. Change is anticipated and is present, dormant in reflection. But reflection is useless if, while you're engaging in it, turning thoughts over and over in your head, mentally repeating what the preacher or the psychotherapist may be saying to you, it's useless if you are not relating your reflection to your own personal anxieties, your fear, your worry, your anguish, your struggle, your difficulties, your relationships, your encounters, your guilt. If you are not saying, what is Pastor Smith's saying to me that has to do with where I'm personally living or engaged in any particular moment? Until you make that connection where your question that you posed wants to take you, won't happen. There'll be no movement, no transformation, no being born again, no internal revolution. You will enter church a young sinner, and you will die an old sinner.
Alante.
My question is very quick. I'm sorry. We are impressed upon the people, ancestors, family members that come before us in these same careers, whether it's business, preaching, even in the postures of a lot of the leaders that are on the wall. We are impressed by them and remnants of them. And the thing about them, a lot of these people on the wall, they were first people to do the things that look like us. So to the young Morehouse man and to the young Spelman woman or woman in the room, could you both speak to the mere presence of now, where I am now as a young college student, where I am now as a young minister, appreciating where I am, who I am, and not trying to be so much in the image of a W.E.B. Du Bois or a Reverend Bryant or a Reverend Smith? How do I cherish the moment now in which I am and not trying to be the old Baptist preacher?
We have been stifled by the first. A few years ago, the NAACP celebrated their 100th anniversary in New York, and Reverend Jesse Jackson was the speaker for the banquet, and I was sitting next to our former chair of the board, Merle Evers-Williams. Merle Evers-Williams leaned over to me while Jesse Jackson was speaking and said to me, "Do you know what his problem is?" So I said, "Who?" And Reverend Jackson said, "No, ma'am." Said, "He's lived too long that we don't have, Dewey, a role model of how to retire from civil rights." So as a consequence, we have the oldest leadership that black people has ever had. Louis Farrakhan is 81. Reverend Sharpton is 65. Maxine Waters is 82. Because we have not to learn how to pass the baton. And so that we are still hanging on to the splendor of being first. And so I am, Pastor Dewey and I are caught in a traffic jam at 5051 to be thought of as young leaders. And the traffic jam that has happened for the generation of ahead of me has slowed you down. So my whole class, not Morehouse, my class of leaders messed it up for those coming behind. So I'm a part of the Brat Pack. I came through with Jesse Jr., Kwame Kilpatrick, Harold Ford Jr., Kendrick Meeks, and all of them have gone to jail. And that's my class of leaders. So it slowed down your group because those who are 50 are waiting for a chance. So the 50-year-olds are waiting for the people who are 80.
Wow.
And now you have the oldest class of in America's history. You have the oldest class of pastors. That the average pastor of a megachurch is 67. So Pastor Smith and I being an exit away are a national anomaly. So you can't even find, if you go in another city, 2 young pastors, black, pastoring megachurches. So we don't like talking in these terms of sometimes it skips a generation. And so our responsibility, if you can imagine Pastor Smith's successor, my successor, quite frankly, is prepping for SATs. Nobody on my staff will succeed me. And we have to get to the reality of what do we do, because we are convinced that our anointing is not seasonal and think that it is eternal. And when do we shift from player to coach? And so we have inherited this model, you got to pay your dues, when we didn't. I'll give you this and I'll yield to Pastor Smith. Pastor Smith, for critical analysis, built a megachurch. He was not called to one. I need to say that as an asterisk to make my point. You are living, sir, in a generation where you may witness the birth and death of megachurches in one generation. So just five, Dewey, only 5 black mega churches have transitioned. Bishop G.E. Patterson, K.C. Price, Ivy Hilliard, New Birth, and West Angeles. And I got to say this to you in shame and embarrassment to young preachers who are here. I am the only one who has taken a mega church that wasn't a relative. And so you have to think through what does this mean that's clogging up the system when we have sanctified nepotism, and we don't have a model of it working in a place of full efficiency. Yeah, my sister was asking. I didn't want her. Yes. Yes.
Can I sit down? I'm not feeling too well. I'm sorry, sir.
Yes.
Look around.
Yes. I don't think it's going to reach that far, but okay.
By God's grace.
All right.
Okay, so it's actually a question and a sentence. Everything is, I don't like speaking in public, so yes. I'm very anxious. But after I gave my life to Christ, what do you do when you give your life to Christ, then you lose everything? Your family they turn their back on you. And it's like, I'm African, I'm Nigerian, so the tradition follows me. It's like when you say no, the way they want you to do things, then you're proud. So I struggle with I'm supposed to look a certain way to be humble.
Yes.
And when I try to follow the, like you said, greater, right? When I try to do great things, like follow the call of God in my life or pursue a career, my family thinks it's too much for me. Like they don't believe in me. So I had to leave them because they were very toxic in Texas, and I relocated here. I don't know anybody, and I see myself struggling with pursuing what I want to do is not me being humble. Like they've left a scar in me that struggles with self-esteem, because now I feel like I'm being disobedient because the Bible says honor your parents and all. So they've used that in training me to the point where I feel like I should disobey God to obey them so that they can help me back on my feet. But fortunately for me, I'm in a shelter like 11 minutes away. I watched Dr. Bryant on the TV, so I said, let me come here and get the service, and you said greater. So for some reason, I've been sketching some stuff for him.
Thank you.
And I was like, your preaching told me to just step up. I don't really like to talk, so this is, what do you do? Do I disobey God and go back?
Let me say a word about that quickly. You know, our context is different. But I can relate from this perspective. You know, I came to Morehouse as an 18-year-old. I started preaching at 17. And my sophomore year here at Morehouse, I was called to pastor my first church. I was 19 years old, sophomore. And my great-great-grandmother's church. And my father, who's also a pastor, didn't want me to pastor. He didn't tell me that, but he didn't want me to pastor church. His heart was for me to finish school because he felt like I wasn't mature enough, and he felt like by pastoring it would slow me down and I wouldn't finish my education. So his desire was for me to finish my education before I got a church. But I knew God had called me to pastor this church. God called me to pastor young. God calls people young for two reasons. He calls some people that while they're young, God calls them because they're committed and they're mature. Then God calls some while they're young because God knows if he doesn't get them while they're young, he'll never get them. I was in that latter category. If he didn't get me early, he wasn't going to get me at all. And so I was called to pastor, and my dad had major challenges, told everybody else except me. His desire was for me to succeed him, but he never said it. But I knew as clearly as your voice was speaking that God had called me. So I took the church, and I was faithful to the church. And he always had thoughts about me leading. When I moved here 18 years ago, he thought I was moving too quickly, that I should have been good where I was because I had a great situation. He thought I'm starting over, it was too risky. So both my pastorage, my father didn't believe in it. He told his mother, my grandmother, and my mother told me before she passed, he wanted me to stay there to be his successor. Okay. Well, my dad just retired in August of this year, after 50 years, to go to your point. So I ought to have been 50 years old as a youth pastor, just taking over the church in August. I've been pastoring for 32 years, doing ministry on a very high level. But if I had followed what my dad wanted, I would have never become who God has called me to be. And so while I love him, while I respect him, while I honor him, while I glean from the wisdom, I have to realize that the call of God on my life was more important than the respect and honor I had for my dad. And so to start with nothing, I had nothing. My salary was $50 a week. Okay, I paid my own tuition. I drove a 1981 Toyota Corolla Tercel that went 35 miles per hour downhill with the wind behind it. And I have a father who's been a millionaire since I've been in college. But I didn't feel comfortable going because his direction was not the direction God called me to do. So I struggled. I had me 2 or 3 other roommates. We chipped on crystals. You can buy 4 of them. And for fries and a drink, get 2 waters, and we get 1 apiece, and we cut the other one up in 3 ways. And I believed in what God had called me to do. And if I have not followed the plan of God for my life, I preached almost every continent. I preached all over the world. I just would have been coming up senior pastor, to go to Dr. Bryant's point. I'd have been making $100 a week, perhaps, at his church as his youth pastor. And I'm 50 years old. So there comes a time when you have to say like David. David's dad also didn't believe he qualified for coronation. Everybody else was invited to the coronation except David. You can be dismissed by your daddy and not regarded by your brothers, but your oil knows your name. And when your father and your mother forsake you, then the Lord will take you up. So you stay faithful, you work hard, develop relationships, and start small. You don't expect that you're going to walk into business and tomorrow you're going to blow up. Don't let this social media mentality. The only place where success comes before work is the dictionary. But if God has called you, you follow the plan of God. And when everybody else walks out, I am a witness. God will take care of you. You follow the plan of God, the call of God on your life. I'm a witness of that.
I want to add to Dr. Smith, but from a different lane. And I want to, what state in Nigeria are you from? Imo State. I want to caution you not to adopt a westernized Christ.
Amen.
That in America we worship the God of success as if that's the only place where he lives. And that he is absent of the struggle and the process. Dr. Smith, I would be able to tell you the instance where Jesus was teaching. There's a knock on the door. The ushers pass him a note. You got family outside. And he asks, who are they? And the most difficult warfare you'll ever go through is with your own family. And once you get to that place, you're going to have to really find in him what is your calling, what is your raison d'etre, your reason for being. I shared just a few weeks ago after Jesus said, don't you know I'm about my Father's business? His Father never spoke to him again. And once you know what it is that you are called to do and how you are to do it, you have to go another way. My dad, I'm a 3rd generation preacher, and my dad didn't want me to start a church. Church plants are not normal in AME. We either got to wait for somebody to die or wait for somebody to become a bishop, which may be the same thing, but in one way or another. But you have to, Shakespeare said, to thine own self be true. That's a very difficult tightrope to walk from a culture of people who are not used to parental support. Can you imagine your complaint is your parents want you to be humble about being great? And you are now in an environment where extracurricular activities are not on the table if they come with an expense. To pursue your dream is an affront to finding a job. That for our community, your passion is your hobby, not your assignment. And so I am grateful that you are on that journey, on that walk. And it is not an easy one, but we have reduced Christ to a guidance counselor and a wealth coach. He has got to be sometimes a companion of poverty, of walking me through it while it is that I am in it. John Kennedy said, if you want to see a great success, look for a great failure. Because anybody who has succeeded had to fail first. But know that in this room, and I hope this room will back me up, in this room, we are your family. And I don't want you to feel like you're in it by yourself. The book of Acts gives us the blueprint of how to handle you, is that all of us have to come together. It is a poor witness to know your predicament and leave you in it. To just pray for you is a curse. Thank you, Mother.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for being here. I honor you for all of the foundations you all have laid. Oh. Thank you so much for being here and for taking this question. I honor you both for the foundations that you've laid. I'm very humbled. Thank you so much. My question is, with the roles that you all carry, can you describe your personal spiritual life, how much time you spend in prayer and your word in order to remain humble?
Let me talk about one of my challenges, of course, with in terms of my own personal devotional life. I was a voracious reader, and read often until I got married and had kids. And what happened for me is a lot of my reading then took on sermon prep form. And so I found myself not reading devotionally, but reading for preparation purposes. And so reading and meditating was just to get a message, but not for my own personal fulfillment. And it was work. And if you don't have, and now I'm regaining my devotional life, where I'm spending time in meditation and aloneness and celebration of discipline, that Richard Foster talked about. So I'm doing more in terms of that. Also, I think one of the things I've done throughout the pandemic has blessed me, Pastor Bryant, is I was doing a lot of things pre-pandemic that I thought were good ideas, living up to the expectations of other people. And I find myself overwhelmed and burnt out because I'm doing a lot of good things. But these good things that I'm doing, none of them are vision-based. I find myself doing stuff that God never called me to do. So I'm at a season in my life now since the pandemic where I ask myself the question, what is my vision? Pastor Bryant preached about it earlier. And so my decisions, my investments are based on my vision. And now I live by the mantra, if it's not in my vision, then why is it on my calendar? Because I've made time for things and people who have nothing to do with what God has called me to do. So I would encourage you, whatever you ask God to show you, what is my life? What has God called me to do? Be clear on that and invest your time in yourself spiritually, physically, emotionally, mentally, to appropriate your investment. Be wise with your energy. And that's what I'm working on now in this season of my life, being a better steward of my energies, my resources, and my time.
Mine is, my mother's an intercessor, but I really amplified my prayer life by preaching in Africa. So I was going to Nigeria, going to Kenya, going to South Africa, and seeing demonstrations, signs, and wonders. And I was trying to figure out, Dewey, why was I seeing it there and not seeing it here? And it is noteworthy that the black church has produced the world's greatest gospel singers, the greatest preachers in the world, second to none, are black preachers. It is unnerving. There is not one black preacher nationally who's built a ministry on signs and wonders. And I asked some of my African colleagues why, and they said the time black preachers spend on preparation, we spend in prayer. And it changed my whole approach to prayer, so that I breathe prayer in a different kind of way than I did years ago. That I now pray over stuff. In the earlier parts of my ministry, I didn't. I now pray about how I am opening the doors of the church. I am now praying about the people who are coming before they get there. Not for the crowd, but for the transformation. I now pray at a deeper level for revelation that is not printed. That I don't want to be able to cite a reference, but to say that God downloaded it. And so my prayer life has got me into a place of codependency. That I had to go through things in life where, regrettably, preaching became my profession and not my call. It is what I did. And there are a lot of us who are gifted, who, if we are not consecrated, can just surrender to be talented. That there is no aftermath from it. And the only way to really move into that is through a life of disciplined prayer. And so that has been a process for me.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming out. We really do appreciate your presence here tonight. And to our preachers, thank you both, sirs, for your tremendous word.